Alright, so my day job is in sports media, and I've been geeking about the whole Pat McAfee ESPN drama.
Now, there are some people actively trying to sabotage us from within ESPN.
If you do not know what I'm talking about, give me like 2 minutes and I'll catch you up to speed. Alright, so who's Pat McAfee? Once upon a time, he's one of the greatest, no, not the greatest, one of the punters for Colts. Today, he's one of the biggest sports media figures right next to Stephen A. And his show, The Pat McAfee Show, blew the fuck up on YouTube for the last couple of years. And why did it work? Because it looked like what generic dudes look like when they talk about sports.
I want to talk about how inspiring this show is, and also fuck Boston College.
ESPN from the sidelines was obviously quietly noticing all this, while their own shows did not do as well. ESPN ends up last summer firing a bunch of their people, cleared house, and cut Pat a massive check for 5 years to license the show. All Pat had to do was just not drop the F-bomb for like FCC reasons, and he would get the money. His show would be on like ESPN's airwaves, his show would still be on YouTube, and it seemed fine until now.
We're very thankful for the ESPN folks being very hospitable. Now, there are some people actively trying to sabotage us from within ESPN. Funny. More specifically, I believe Norby Williamson is the guy who is attempting to sabotage our program. I'm not 100% sure. That is just seemingly the only human that has information, and then somehow that information gets leaked and it's wrong, and then it sets a narrative of what our show is.
So Pat basically goes on air and says that ESPN from within the house is trying to sabotage his show. He name drops this exec, this Norby Williamson guy, and says that he is allegedly responsible for leaking false information, damaging the reputation of the Pat McAfee show. This New York Post story basically claimed that the money Pat brings for ESPN is not enough to justify the baggage, the apparent baggage, the liability that is Pat McAfee. He's kind of a loose cannon. He has Aaron Rodgers on his show, someone who does not play by anyone's rules, and he thinks that Norby Williamson leaked this information to New York Post to get this headline because Norby does not like Pat's show. This news broke while Pat already had his hands full because Aaron Rodgers went on his show and kind of sort of jokingly said that Jimmy Kimmel, the late night comedian, may or may not have been involved in the whole Epstein situation.
This has something to do with the Epstein list that came out?
A lot of people, including Jimmy Kimmel, are really hoping that doesn't happen.
He was obviously joking, but Jimmy Kimmel took it seriously and kind of sort of threatened to sue Aaron Rodgers, and all of this happened on ESPN's airwaves on Pat McAfee's show. So is Pat responsible for this? I do not know. So yeah, there's a lot going on here, and for someone like who works in sports media, myself, I'm super interested in what all of this means for the future of the space, for independent media, for ESPN, for Pat. So I talked to David Huckstead. He's one of my oldest friends in the world of media, and we had a conversation about Pat, about ESPN. He writes about all of this for a living, and he, funny enough, was the first person to get the clip out of Pat calling out ESPN on Twitter and kind of sort of went viral for it. So yeah, we had a cool conversation about Pat, about ESPN, what it means for the world of sports media. So yeah, it's kind of a nerd fest, but if you're interested, keep watching. Let's quickly go back in time and go through the history of how Pat McAfee's show was acquired. And I want to choose my word really specifically because it was not exactly acquired, because acquisition means that ESPN would come in and say that, hey, Pat McAfee, you no longer can do your own show. We are going to pay you a shit ton of money and buy your show to show exclusively on ESPN. But that's not exactly what happened. ESPN realized that, hey, we are no longer at a point that we can cultivate our own talent. So we need to go out there and get someone who has already built his empire. So let's go back in time and talk about the relationship between Pat McAfee and ESPN.
So what you just said there, that's a really good point to draw back to, because there's a big misconception out there that ESPN owns the Pat McAfee show. It does not. It was really more of a licensing deal that I think pays McAfee just under $20 million a year for the right to also air the show on ESPN. McAfee still owns the show. He still owns the IP. He's still in complete editorial control of it, which is why he can have whatever guest he wants on. ESPN is paying this absolutely astronomical amount of money just to put it on TV, even though they have no control over it. So it had been a while in the making. McAfee had been appearing on ESPN over the past several years. It seemed to be a little bit hit or miss, and then he got the game day role where he really, really exploded in popularity. And then about a year after that, they acquire or license the Pat McAfee show. So essentially what it boils down to is ESPN, and we've written about this extensively at Outkick, ESPN does not have the ability to cultivate talent anymore. They can't really develop anyone from the ground up like you would develop a baseball player or a basketball player. So instead what they did is they went out and wrote a massive check to get the most popular sports commentator on the internet to come join their company. If you can't develop talent, you have to pay for it instead, and that's how ESPN licensed the Pat McAfee show.
I obviously want to go back to the Pat McAfee thing, but I still want to double click on the fact that ESPN, a billion-dollar company with insane amount of staff and production and writers and HR and media and comms and PR, is not able to cultivate their own talents like they were used to way back when Stephen A's show came out. Why do you think sports media and like media in general is at a point where big behemoth media companies are no longer able to build their own talents anymore?
Well, there's a handful of different reasons. Number one, ESPN for a long time under the old boss, John Skipper, went way off the tracks and stopped focusing on sports. Instead, started focusing on every political left-leaning woke ideology you can think of. You can go back to the Kaepernick stuff. You can go back to the BLM, things of that nature. So ESPN kind of stopped. The ratings tanked. The ratings crashed. So big-time talent also realized at the same time that was going on is that they don't need to be at ESPN to be successful. They can, one, do it on their own. They can join another network. They can go to YouTube. They can go to social media. So some of the best people that would, in theory, be available instead just chose to go out on their own, do their own thing, or go elsewhere. And at the same time, like I said, that's happening. You have ESPN muddled in all these controversies, all these issues. It's no longer really a sports network. It's trying to dabble in politics. Well, asking sports commentators to discuss politics is a disaster in and of itself, and it turned the viewers off. I mean, you know as well as I do, most people don't watch ESPN anymore unless it's just for the games itself. They're not going there to get commentary at 9 a.m. When I was in college, we used to wake up and watch First Take before class. I don't know anyone who does that anymore.
All right, so let's go back to Pat. And this thing didn't happen out of thin air. Pat, as he says, that someone is trying to sabotage his show within ESPN. So how exactly are they doing that? Pat is actually referring to a New York Post story which came out a couple of days ago where the headline reads, Pat McAfee needs to produce better ratings to be worth $85 million and headaches for ESPN. So basically the claim here is Pat McAfee is not generating enough revenue to justify the money he's getting paid to do it, and also the extra baggage of Pat McAfee, which Pat McAfee's show brings, referring mostly to the Aaron Rodgers stuff and the fact that Pat McAfee is kind of a loose cannon. To what extent do you think this is a valid claim?
Well, number one, I doubt there's any validity to that. Pat McAfee, other than Stephen A., is the only major name left at ESPN, the only name people constantly talk about. That is what he's referring to when someone is trying to kneecap him, because how would anyone have that internal data and just leak it to the New York Post? I mean, you've worked in media. You know numbers like that are closely guarded, that very few people have complete access to them. So, again, it really narrows the pool of people who could do it. There's no question Pat McAfee brings in more for ESPN than he takes. When you look at the headlines he generates on a daily basis, whether it's interviewing Aaron Rodgers, whether it's interviewing Nick Saban, whether it's interviewing anyone you can think of, Pat McAfee makes news whenever he's in front of a camera. No one else at ESPN, other than maybe Stephen A., and I would argue to a lesser degree, is capable of doing that. So that's completely false. That's like saying your star quarterback who's winning you, the only reason you're winning games, isn't worth the hassle because you don't like some of the things he said. It's complete nonsense.
This story is super interesting to media nerds like you and I here, because it's not just about like ESPN and Pat, it's also about Aaron Rodgers. So if, for those who don't know, Aaron Rodgers went on Pat's show and jokingly kind of like claimed that Jimmy Kimmel was on Epstein's plane. Jimmy Kimmel, a comedian, by the way. And someone like Kimmel, who made his living by joking about other people, kind of sort of did not take this whole thing lightly at all. He went bazooka on Aaron Rodgers on Twitter. So the question here is, to what extent do you think hosts should be responsible for what the guests say on their show? And this is important because a lot of people want to have this discussion about platforming and deplatforming. So they want to come down on Pat and be like, hey, so you are not allowed to platform crazy people like Aaron Rodgers.
In order to talk about that, we even have to go a step further back, because everyone thinks that Aaron Rodgers started this Epstein Kimmel thing out of thin air, but that's not actually what happened. Either in this past March, I believe, so about a year ago, Kimmel was talking about conspiracy theories and put your tinfoil hats back on and how Rodgers must have a concussion and all these things. And David Bakhtiari, who is an old teammate of Aaron Rodgers, tweeted something along the lines of, tell me you're on the Epstein list without telling me you're on the Epstein list. I'm paraphrasing that. So Bakhtiari responded to a joke Kimmel made, which is the baseline of this entire situation. Rodgers, when he made that comment, was just simply referring to Kimmel's old comment about how if you believe in these conspiracy theories, you're a kook and a nut job. Rodgers wasn't implying he was on the list. He was simply circling back to Kimmel's own words, okay? Kimmel then claims you're putting my family in danger. I might sue you. Sue him for what? He's literally referencing a joke Kimmel made. And the other thing to remember is Kimmel wants to be a comedian. That's what he claims to be. Now, he hasn't been funny in a long time. And then the moment someone makes a joke about him, because remember, Kimmel gets paid to joke about other people. The moment someone makes a joke about him, he threatens to sue them. That's utterly ridiculous. As for should a host be responsible for what a guest says, the answer to that is obviously no. Just like a guest should not be responsible for something a host says. If I'm a guest on a show and the host goes off a deep end or says something crazy, I don't know. I don't know ahead of time that's going to happen. And if I'm the guest and I say something crazy, the host doesn't say it. But the overreaction to that is simply absurd because, again, Rodgers was referencing a joke David Bakhtiari and Kimmel made a long time ago, and now Kimmel wants to play the victim card. So McAfee didn't do anything wrong. Rodgers didn't do anything wrong. It's a joke. Everyone overreacted. ESPN overreacted. The whole thing is, quite frankly, a little embarrassing.
We both work in media, and we have seen the space kind of sort of evolve from a point where content creators and people who are good at just media in general, at being the talent specifically, have always needed the help of bigger media companies to put their word out, to give them shows, to give them sort of like the infrastructure, which is production, which is media, which is editing, which is social media, to be able to do their show. But it's no longer kind of sort of the case, and you can see the trend in big talent and in smaller talents, obviously. So specifically, let's talk about like Stephen A. Stephen A. not no longer, he also has his ESPN show, which is First Take, but at the same time, he has built an insane following just doing his own show, which is like the Stephen A. show on YouTube and on SiriusXM. So the point being, if someone like Stephen A. can realize that, hey, I also simultaneously need to build my own house while working in someone's rented house, which is ESPN, what do you think the state of union is for bigger media companies? Because they are realizing that they no longer have the power here, because talents can just like pack up their bag and just do their own show. And the question of leverage is obviously on the talent side, because talents realize that, hey, I'm doing you a favor by, doing a show for you. Obviously, it's a broader statement because smaller hosts may not have that leverage, because someone like Max Kellerman got fired from ESPN. So the question is, what do you think the state of union is for talents and bigger media companies and their dynamic vis-a-vis being able to work together?
Well, I think it leads to seeing these massive behemoth like ESPN ultimately either being completely downgraded in its capabilities or just collapsing entirely, because people are realizing that the internet is a much better forum by and large than standard television. I mean, look at all the cord cutting that's gone on. Look at how many people have just completely decided that they're not going to do that. They're just going to get some apps like Hulu or Netflix, Amazon, whatever it might be. And I think there's something to be said for freedom, right? Like, you could even make a little less money, but freedom is, what's that worth to you? To a lot of people, it's worth a ton, because you don't have someone breathing down your neck. You don't have someone telling you what to do. You can book whatever guests you want. You don't have to book certain guests. My guess is the more popular all these one-offs become, whether it's McAfee or, to go back to Stephen A., or anyone else that has a really, Tim Dillon, for example. Tim Dillon is one of the best comedians in existence, and all he does is his podcast, and he's never going to spend 1 second of time worrying about network TV, right? I think that's going to become the norm, and that's probably going to lead to a lot more free thought, a lot more creativity, and that's good news for the consumer.
So let's look at some previous examples. Obviously, ESPN has had their hands full with talents being fired, and talents are unhappy with what ESPN is standing for. And you know what? To empathize with ESPN, I get it. They're a big company. It's a big umbrella. People are going to have a lot of different opinions. We specifically remember Jamel Hill being fired and then Bill Simmons. Both of them in their own rights were able to transition to building their own ship. And Bill Simmons obviously made a shit ton of money. I think like something like 200 or 250 million by selling The Ringer to Spotify. So obviously in these two situations, it kind of sort of worked out for the talents. But from a brand perspective, how do you think media companies, big media companies, should handle talent disputes like such?
Well, in the case, I can see you got Jamel Hill up here. In the case of Jamel Hill, the reason she was fired is quite simple. Her talents did not outweigh the issues she brought with her. Let's not forget, she called Trump, the president of the United States, a white supremacist. It had a long history of just insane political statements that have no place in the sports world. She embraced all that stuff, and she didn't put up big ratings. No one was paying attention to her actual job. No one was watching her. So in a case like that, it's very easy, I imagine, for ESPN to be like, this person is becoming a headache. We don't want to deal with it. She's not bringing in what she's taking out, so we're going to get rid of them. In terms of what the company should look out for, if it's a publicly traded company, it's going to look out for the stockholders. Obviously, that's supposed to be the number one thing. I think that companies, just like sports teams, are willing to tolerate a lot from people who are very talented and make them a ton of money, right? If you're not talented and you don't make them a ton of money, you're probably going to be gone as soon as your contract expires, or you're going to be fired for cause if there's issues. What I would say in terms of, should the company play it safe? Should the company be risky? You got to be authentic. It's okay to be safe. It's okay to be risky. It just has to be believable and real. That's why people like Pat McAfee, because they know when he says something, he's an authentic guy. It's not scripted. I mean, look at how many issues people have had with the show at times. It's not scripted. They're just riffing and things get said. So above all else, if I was running ESPN, we got to be authentic. We got to be true to the viewers. McAfee represents that. Jamel Hill did not. So that is, in my opinion, Bill Simmons was fired after he was suspended for comments about Roger Goodell. Bill Simmons has made a ton of money outside of ESPN. So I'm sure Bill Simmons couldn't care less that he's not at ESPN anymore. He's too busy sleeping on a mattress, $100 bills. Those are decisions companies make, and they screw them up a lot. I think Jamel Hill, they got right, but that's how I would look at it.
This is not obviously a straight parallel, but a couple of months ago, there was this whole thing about Barstool being sold back to Dave Portnoy for $1. And for people who don't know, Barstool was sold, first of all, partially and then incompletely to Penn National, which is a betting company, because they thought that in their efforts to expand betting across the entirety of the United States, they can use a big media company's help like Barstool. And upon acquiring Barstool, they realized that, oh boy, Barstool is kind of its own loudmouth renegade organization, and they're no longer they don't really want to play the game of PR and kind of walking on eggshells, especially when they are led by someone who is as belligerent as Dave Portnoy in the best way possible. I really like Dave. So the question is, to what extent do you think the marriage of big media companies or companies which want to acquire smaller media companies, smaller like Barstool is small, how do you think that plays out? Because when it's happening, it looks like a great deal for both parties, because someone like Barstool or Dave think that they're about to get so much money and they can expand and they can do this and they can do that. And the bigger company, which is Penn, realizes that, oh boy, now that we have Barstool, we get the access to the cool kids, the college kids, and they will be betting now. But it doesn't exactly play out in the best of terms. So how do you think content creators and media companies should navigate acquisitions?
Well, I think companies definitely might be interested in that. The question you got to ask yourself is, the content creator / personality going to be interested in that? And I'll bring up 2 points. The first one is, imagine you're someone in the media, sports media right now, and ESPN comes to you and they say, hey, we want to license your show. We want to bring you on. But you've watched this entire Pat McAfee disaster unfold where he's accusing ESPN of trying to essentially knife them in the back while looking them in the face, right? Shake their hand while you stab them in the back. Why would any content creator sign up for that? Why would they want anything to do with that, especially
money, I guess, in the beginning, because it looks enticing for the content creator or the person who founded the company. Be like, hey, this company's come in and cut a huge check, and I've built this house for ages and years, and now I get to kind of sort of like sell off in the sunset, and this company is going to take care of the rest.
Yeah, but that's what I say, other than the money. But a guy like Pat McAfee had $100+ million deal before he went to ESPN. So it's not like a guy like Dave Portnoy has been rich for a very, very, very long time. So unless you desperately need the money, which is not likely if you're already famous on your own, right? Because if you know what you're doing, you've monetized that, you're making good money, and you don't want to be told what to do. Why would you ever agree to that? I can see the networks attempting it. I can't see a whole lot of talent saying yes to it, given what Pat McAfee said yesterday. Point number 2 is these big companies might not realize exactly what they're getting into. Let's go to the Barstool example. Penn was using Barstool to essentially promote its gambling operations, its gambling apps, things like that. They quickly found out that state regulators, right or wrong, and I personally think wrong, didn't want to give licenses to Penn because of the things Barstool was saying, because of what their personalities were joking about. They joke about gambling. They joke about a can't-lose parlay, which was obviously a joke, but the regulators claimed that it was manipulating and misleading, so the regulators clearly didn't get it. So Penn spends all this money, I believe $700 million roughly, to acquire Barstool, and then finds out what they acquire them for isn't even going to be allowed to happen because the regulators won't allow it to. And so that also is a cautionary tale. I just don't see a happy marriage between too many big corporations and independent media voices.
Let's look at like what ESPN puts out in general. Their prime breadwinner is live sports. They make a lot of money by licensing live sports. But at the same time, they're realizing now that commentary is something which is done best online by independent figures like Pat McAfee. So what do you think is the future of commentary being part of what sports media companies or media companies in general do?
What is the most popular ESPN production outside of live sports that people wake up for every Saturday morning? They're glued to their TVs. It's College Game Day. College Game Day is 3 hours of straight commentary. It's an opinion-based show. It's 5 guys getting together, doing what guys do, talking about football. That works because it's directly tied to the live sports product. You take 5 guys and you throw them around a table on a Thursday afternoon, which obviously ESPN does as well, nobody's going to really care because it's not directly tied. We know that when game day ends, we know that the moment game day ends, there's going to be 30 football games that were just discussed that I now get to immediately consume, whether that be on ESPN, ESPN2, Fox, NBC, CBS, whatever it might be. Outside of that, I don't think so, because what's the motivation? Why should I, as a consumer, care what 5 or 6 random people have to say about a game that's not going to happen for 4 more days? And what ESPN really gets wrong, and they're not the only ones guilty of this, but it's certainly something they do the most. People want to enjoy sports for the most part, the average fan, from the 50,000-foot view. They want to see the big picture, right? It's like if you're up in space, they want to see the whole globe. They're the kind of guy, they're a lot like me. They want to go to the bar with their buddies. They want to eat chicken wings. They want to drink some beer. And they want to talk about the big picture stuff. I don't care what a guy's passer rating is on third down when it's 8 or more yards. I couldn't care less. You know, as the joke says, football's not an analytics game. It's about God. Go with your gut. Obviously, that's a little bit comedic, but it's true. I couldn't care less about guys debating statistics. I don't care. I do care about guys talking about the atmosphere, the rivalry, the history. That gets me, and that's why Game Day is so incredible, where most ESPN productions are just an absolute snooze fest.
Okay, let's try to sit on the other side of the table. You and I have both worked with managers and C-level folks in big media companies. Some of them are our friends. Let's try to empathize with them for a second. How do you think they should handle the fact that the tide is kind of changing and content creators, independent, or people who work in the company, they kind of sort of have a lot of power and leverage regarding their career and the state of the media atmosphere in general, and they kind of feel like a little bit neutered because, you know, like it's social media era now. You no longer are beholden to whether or not you are allowed to go on air. You're allowed to say things that you want to say. So where do you think this all leads for the managerial class of media?
Well, I was told once by a person who has been super successful in life in media that the reason they pay people on TV so much money isn't because they're necessarily worth it. It's because they want to stop them from killing themselves. And maybe if we make them rich, they won't off themselves. That was a legitimate comment. And they said it, these managers, their job is to manage suicidal millionaires. Okay. Now, I don't know how accurate that is. I'm not a TV star making $15-20 million a year. It goes back to, is the talent outweighing the issue? If the talent outweighs the problems, then you just got to suck it up and deal with it. If I'm a manager, and as you know, I've had employees in the past at my old job that I had to manage and deal with and figure out all that stuff, obviously on a much smaller scale than, ESPN or Pat McAfee. If the person is causing a problem and they can't be fixed, they don't want to change, they're not interested in being educated, then you just have to have a tough conversation and let them go. If they are able to adapt or change, or in this situation, they just hold so much power and make so much money, there's nothing you can do, then unfortunately you're kind of like a neutered person if you're at ESPN in a leadership role, because there's nothing you can do. And I don't envy anyone in that situation, because imagine a guy who technically works under you. In all reality, you can scream at him all you want. It's going to make no difference. It's a thankless job. So, I mean, there's not really any good advice to give anyone who's in a managerial role at ESPN what to do, because they, again, are handcuffed because McAfee can get up from the table and walk away. And if he does, those managers will probably end up getting fired themselves for costing the company so much money.
Okay, so let's talk about how this situation can end. In my head, it can lead in like two ways. One is ESPN lets Pat go off easily and be like, hey, so you get a 2-week suspension and you cannot have Aaron Rodgers on anymore. I exactly don't know how the specifics of that will work out, because Pat pays Aaron Rodgers. I think Pat pays Aaron Rodgers to come on his show because he knows that Aaron Rodgers coming to my show is a huge thing, but Aaron Rodgers does not go on any other show because he doesn't trust media. And the other thing which can happen is like ESPN decides that, hey, so it's not worth the hassle, which I think would be a huge mistake for ESPN, because like Pat is kind of sort of the only one of two reasons why anyone watches ESPN. The first is Stephen A. and obviously the live sports is there as well. So TLDR, how do you think this thing ends?
Well, this situation is all about leverage, right? And I got bad news for ESPN. They have none. McAfee has all the cards, because let's say they fire Pat McAfee. Again, they don't own his show. There's nothing they can do. He's just going to go back to YouTube, and then he's going to go nuclear on ESPN. You think what happened Friday caused headlines? Wait until you see what a man who thinks he has nothing left to lose anymore really gets cut loose. ESPN can't punish him, because if they do, he could just, I assume, lawyers would obviously have to be involved, terminate the deal, walk away, and then the one thing people care about at ESPN other than game day is gone. And if he does that, he's obviously off game day. They've been almost essentially grooming him to maybe be the star after Lee Corso. So are they really going to risk that, all the time and money they've poured into that? McAfee shouldn't have changed, shouldn't apologize, and ESPN has no cards to play. I mean, I don't know. Okay, so we're going to tell him that he can't be on TV for 2 weeks. Why is he going to care about that? He built his entire life on YouTube. That's the most hollow threat. If I was Pat McAfee and they told me that, I'd laugh in their face. Go ahead and do it. See if I care. What's the point of having FU money if you don't occasionally get to say FU? ESPN has no moves here that end well for them. Having said that, I think the Pat McAfee ESPN marriage will be heading on a speed track for divorce sooner than later. I don't think he likes it. I don't think he wants to stay. I don't think he likes having to deal with a lot of the controversy. And he obviously does not like allegedly being stabbed in the back by his own team, if you will.